Jack, have you ever been to Dayton, Ohio?
I have not in person. I have, if you count YouTube, I have, but not.
If you count YouTube and Google Maps, huh?
Yeah, and Netflix too. I watched American Factory, which I believe was filmed in Dayton at a glass factory, but I haven't been there in person.
Hmm.
I don't know. Is there
Wait,
something? Is there something important about Dayton that I should know?
well, I mean, I'm just saying, like I went to Dayton 2 days ago, to the National Air Force Museum. It's in what is it, Wright Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. It's really epic. You need to go there.
What kind of things do they have? Is it like
Air
space
Force.
related? Just Air Force related and nothing else.
Well, no, they have. So it's they have like they have like quite a few like huge sections of planes, right? So they have like the early years, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War, the Cold War in general, and it's just Air Force vehicles, Air Force planes from all you know basically basically military jets since the beginning of the Air Force, right? Um, they also have there was also, let's see, there was also, I believe, Kennedy's Air Force One, the President Kennedy's 707 back then, as well as there was a small what do you call it, rocket exhibition too. I don't know. Are you a big space fan?
Well, in all honesty, I'm really not like a big stickler for space in a sense. I've enjoyed the times I've been to museums. Actually, I think the only one I've been to in recent memory is the Advar Center in DC, which of course we've discussed that you've been to DC recently and you went there as well. That was the only one I've been to, and it was interesting. But like I mentioned, I'm not really that big of a space person in general. But if it's aviation, then I have some nominal interest.
So if you become a billionaire, would you go to space?
I would not. I haven't really spoken out about it, but it does irk me that people like Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson are spending a lot of their money to go to space and to do investments like Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic. Because in reality, what does it really bring people? It takes people into space to just experience like being not even you're not even that far away from the Earth, and you're just circling around the Earth. Actually, and I would much rather just take a super long flight around in the actual like within Earth and just like touring over some of the landscapes rather than looking at it from way outside. And of course, the price would be a lot cheaper. Uh, what are you? Are you
I mean,
are you into space?
am I in a space? Well, no, I'm in Ohio. But actually, I guess just fun fact, Ohio is, not only the birthplace of aviation, Wright brothers, but also, as we proudly proclaim, but also, Neil Armstrong was an Ohioan, John Glenn was an Ohioan. So, you know, the meme. Wait, it's all Ohio. Always has been.
And I'm legitimately curious. So I know I've asked it before. I'd always assumed that the Wright brothers were from North Carolina and from Kitty Hawk. Can you just explain the backstory, because I'm always forgetting that they're
Well,
they're
it's
originally from
actually
Ohio.
it's funny. So I guess Ohio and North Carolina are engaged in this, I guess rivalry, if you will, about who's the real, starter of aviation. Basically you can see it's very visible on the license plates, right? So North Carolina is literally the first flight. It says, what does it say? First in flight, I believe. And Ohio's license plate proudly proclaims, birthplace of aviation. Basically, the Wright brothers, the inventors of the first flight, the airplane, they were born and grew up in Dayton, Ohio. It's where they spent their formative years, where they started their careers, and but the first flight itself was in North Carolina, Kitty Hawk. So as an Ohioan, I will say North Carolina can go, screw itself. but that's basically the rivalry there is, you know.
And you know it's interesting because I would have expected that North Carolina could have capitalized more on actually being home to the first flight, and they could have said themselves to the birthplace of aviation, but they instead just go out to say on the
Well,
license
it
plate
would
like
be
first in flight.
it would I mean it would be inaccurate because they're not the birthplace of aviation, you know.
Yeah, that's true. But
They are physically first in flight. They're not the birthplace, you know, right? I don't know. It's a pretty. I guess it's one of those friendly rivalries, if you will.
and speaking of rivalries, I wanted to shift towards what we intended to talk about in this episode of aviation in the Pacific. I think when it comes to aviation in the Pacific, many people immediately think of Qantas and Air New Zealand. Obviously, that's not the entire picture of of the region. And interestingly, there have been a lot of rivalries over time, and the region has shifted a lot. Uh, so I think it's an interesting region to consider and look at from an aviation perspective, given that there's so many different countries all competing for people. Of course, they're all really lacking in populations and density, and a lot of them have super small economies. And I think because we'll get into this more in the episode, but it's a much different region from any other region there is. To start
Well, okay,
off,
yeah,
yeah, go
yeah. Well,
ahead.
first of all, I mean, let's start off with the premise of what we're talking about. Effectively, the Pacific, right? The entire Pacific region, especially that of Oceania, is just a very interesting place in terms of aviation, right? It's got massive, massive worldwide carriers on its fringes: Qantas, Air New Zealand, United Airlines as well. But the majority of the Pacific, the tiny island nations, they have, you know, the countries themselves are almost, comically small. They have very, very small populations, very, very small economies. And, a lot of countries, they are also very limited in the number of airports as well, right? Now, this is, obviously a big problem since, having a lack of aviation means a lack of connectivity to the rest of the world. Um, and, a lack of aviation also means less economic development, less tourism, less everything, right? So what we have found is on the internet, well, I have found this very long what would you call this? Analysis? A
Yeah,
long
it almost reads like a policy recommendation paper.
policy recommendation. Yeah, it was published by the Asian Development Bank in 2007. I believe it's like what 196 pages, and it's effectively illustrating the the situation of aviation in these Pacific Island nations, right? The challenges, the environment, as well as recommendations. And it's a very long paper. It goes very much in depth with cases, and examples and all that. But I think it's a very interesting thing that we should definitely talk about, especially since normally we don't think about that part of the world at all, even much less in terms of aviation.
Yeah, and the paper certainly is outdated. It was written in 2006, but much of what it talks about is still very much true today. Notably, there's still a heavy presence of Fiji Airways in the region, which I would imagine has surprised a lot of people. That has managed to stay afloat for so long, given that so many other airlines in the region have died out over time. And it's really interesting how also too we've seen recent market entrants from other major international airlines come into the region, and I wonder what the future's going to look like, and all of that's going to be discussed here. Um,
Yeah, so let's start off. Let's talk a little bit about like the challenges, right? So what are the major challenges that are facing the region in terms of, well, I guess just in general, right?
yeah, well, primarily, obviously, like you've mentioned, there's the challenge of density. There's very little demand across the entire region, especially to go inter island. Much of the demand would be to go to the larger cities like Auckland or Sydney or Brisbane. But between the islands themselves, there's very little demand. Secondly, there's also the problem of remoteness. There's particularly far from any other big airports, especially, but even small airports too, like the Tuvalu or Tonga, are still pretty isolated from other places, which makes it hard. I guess when you combine that with the thin demand, you're gonna have thin routes over long distances, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to maintain a profitable route structure. But the other major
Mhm.
issue that I want to highlight, and you can mention your own as well, is the economics of the governments themselves, because they obviously depend heavily on tourism. Much of these islands, especially countries like Nauru, who don't even have any industry at all except for tourism, essentially. But if they're not bringing in that much money, they really don't have that much money to spend on a lot of these aviation ventures, many of which are state owned. And if they can't really sustain themselves, they can't
Mhm.
buy planes, they can't
Mhm.
grow, and it really spirals out of control.
Hmm. So actually, well, yeah, Jack, you gave a lot of examples. But just to bring this all into picture, right? It's the nations are so small that a lot of nations, right, that they are very limited in even the number of airports that they have. So, for example, Nauru, right, the third smallest country in the world, which you just mentioned, it's just one island, is the entire country, and it only has one airport. That's it. The island nation of Samoa has two. Tuvalu, one. Vanuatu, right, another island nation, has four airports, right? That's it in the entire country. Now, let me see. What's the number of airports? What about in the United States? How many are there? How many airports are in the United States? Let's see. 50 no, I'm sorry. 13,513 airports in the United States, right? Versus just single digits in a lot of these countries. That's I'd say that's pretty hard to fly to. Especially since, there's first of all there's quite limited space for much of anything. And you know, that it just means that with the small area that a lot of the countries have, there's not much space for economic development. There's not much space for you know anything really.
And the space point is
Um,
important for airports too, because many of these airports have incredibly short runways as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look at, for example, right, well, the short runways, that's incredibly important, which we'll hold off for a bit. But for example, on in Tuvalu, right, or Nauru, the airport the airport occupies a mass so much space that it is used for other purposes when not being used for flights. Like it's used for playing basketball, for exercise, right, or for hosting events on the runway, just because there's almost no more space available. Which, I mean, if you look at pictures, it's pretty funny, of them playing soccer or basketball on the runway. But as you said, right, the runway length also means that because a lot of these countries are so far away from everywhere else, you're kind of limited in what kind of flights you can operate, because you can't operate long distance, like a flight from, say, Los Angeles or San Francisco to Tuvalu would just not it wouldn't be feasible, because you would need a larger plane with a larger range for that, and there's just not that runway length at the airport. So which means you can only fly routes to and from these countries from, like, Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes it incredibly difficult for some of these inter-island routes to operate. Uh, yeah, and it's just really hard for airlines to maintain themselves over time, uh, especially with on the really small islands like Nauru that itself faces. All it seems seemingly is perpetually in financial struggles to maintain a national airline. But I think, do you want to provide just a reference of like what the market looks like right now? What kind of airlines are operating in that situation?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, like we said before, right? The region is flanked by giants. There's United Airlines, which interestingly, actually, which I guess we should mention here. Since it is also Oceania, United operates their world famous island hopping route to and from Hawaii and Guam. Um, I don't know. Do you know much about that route?
I guess it's important to note that it was inherited by Continental. It wasn't a United started, but it is, I guess, notable that they've managed to keep it alive for the 11 years they've owned Continental and kept all of their routes intact, and it manages to be successful. And this article notes that it connects key military bases in Guam and in the Marshall Islands and in Kwajalein are all very
Well,
important
military.
bases
Well,
too.
military bases are that's for military, but like it is I guess an example, right, of sort of what kind of routes are able to be operated, island hopping effectively, right? So from Hawaii, it goes the United Island hopping route makes its way west to Guam, island to island, atoll to atoll, and that's sort of the situation that we have here, right? There's a giant Qantas to and from Australia and New Zealand to and from where take a guess, right? And then Fiji Airways as well, which is making a name for itself, as well as the often forgotten Air Tahiti Nui, to and from Tahiti, which is certainly becoming more and more famous just because Tahiti is such an amazing world class tourist destination. But aside from that, right, most of the airlines are actually just very very small government run airlines serving like 10 routes total, right? So for example, that would include the likes of Nauru Airlines, that would include I believe Air Vanuatu. It would include all of these airlines which from their home base, right, they only serve a few other ones, basically close by, right? Like Nauru Airlines, they only serve Nauru to, I believe, Majuro in the Marshall Islands, to Tarawa in Kiribati, and to Brisbane in Australia, right? There's no large scale connecting, partially because of the limitations of, aircraft themselves, but mostly because of just the lack of funding, right? There's just not a lot of demand on these routes.
Yeah, and it's interesting that those short haul routes have really continued to struggle. But like you mentioned, there are a lot of long haul presence in the region, like with Air Tahiti Nui and Fiji Airways and the big players. But United too has also branched off from the island hopper as well to offer more long haul services, especially from San Francisco to Tahiti as well. And getting into that market, there's a lot of expansion of long haul routes into the region, which is which is surprising to some degree, given that the region has really struggled otherwise to maintain its short haul flights. But maybe that's destined to change sometime soon.
I mean, I think it's certainly a challenge, right? It's not like people haven't tried to operate routes in the Pacific, recently. Um, but what is certainly more problematic is that there have not been many major improvements in in infrastructure, in economic development, changes in the general environment, right? Be it a country or the region in general, they're all still mostly, you know, relatively poor, relatively underdeveloped nations, right? And so it's certainly not, like you mentioned before, it's certainly not, even though the report was from 2007, 14 years later, it's still the same situation now. Um, but there have been some examples of there have been some examples of what is actually doing well for the region, right? So as you mentioned before, Fiji Airways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Fiji Airways, which if you actually read this report, will be mentioned as Air Pacific. They underwent a name change, and the report also points out heavily that it was invested in. Air Pacific was invested in significantly by Qantas, which allowed an international partner to essentially advertise and code share with Fiji Airways on international routes. But astoundingly, Fiji Airways has managed to build up a presence of relatively shorter haul routes from Fiji and from Nandi specifically that go out to smaller airports like in Samoa or in Tonga or in the Cook Islands, routes that you wouldn't really expect to have traffic, but it's just like a hub and spoke system where if you build up demand over time, you can get people making those connections. And now that Fiji Airways has been profitable consistently, as this report points out, they can actually have consistency when it comes to planes, and now they're leasing two A350s that used to be belong to South Africans, so they're doing quite well for from a compared to every single other airline in the region. And while you wouldn't really expect a city of 43,000 people like Nandi to be such a hub, it's really been good for the region and actually connecting cities that need to. But maybe it's more of just a natural change over time that at some point you need some hub airport centrally located in the region to fly to these points on, because as we've mentioned, it's really unsustainable to just have point to point traffic in the region.
So what kind of routes does Fiji Airways operate? Like you said, as a connector.
Yeah, it's so they operate a lot. They have they have the longer haul routes. They have the Los Angeles to Nandi or the San Francisco to Nandi. Also, they have some East Asian flights. I believe they fly to Hong Kong, and a lot of cities in Australia and New Zealand. But then they have of course the super short in like Fiji domestic flights on much smaller aircraft to places like Suva or other regional cities on the islands. And then they have the flights on their 737 type aircraft on the larger jets to places like Honolulu or to Samoa or to maybe even American Samoa, Cook Islands, places like that or to capital cities of these countries that need a bigger airline really to serve it to actually get like consistent passenger traffic.
And you said this model is profitable? Like there's enough demand for that kind of service? Like especially, to and from, I guess, to and from the smaller islands would make a lot, I guess, more sense. But like there's a lot of traffic to and from like Australia, Hong Kong, and the US.
Yeah, well, of course, when it comes down to it, Fiji is one of the most heavily trafficked tourist destinations in the region, comparable and equatable to places like Tahiti, with a lot of luxury resorts in the area and a lot of people going to beach resorts and the type of that. So it has a lot of tourist demand to places all over Fiji, and that does explain a lot why Nandi has been so successful, because it really is a launching off point for the rest of the country, similar to like Greenland, where the capital city doesn't have a major airport, but you can fly into other cities in the country and get everywhere. And that's really what the airport does, because it is really important to emphasize that Nandi Airport is one of the most developed airports in the region, because it has two runways, it has a lot of terminal buildings, and you pointed out earlier that the airport development is key, because you need to have the facilities to support a lot of services which a lot of these smaller countries don't have.
Hmm. So I mean, like I guess that's one of the main challenges. Like this paper also has a lot of recommendations for what can be done better to help with trade and aviation in the region. But one thing it does not mention, one thing that is not stated directly is like the model of Fiji Airways, right? It's clearly been very successful. Do you think that sort of model would also work with other island nation countries? Like, or is Fiji the only one that has this sort of you know that is able to grow their aviation industry like that?
It's going to be difficult, and like I mentioned, there's really a lot of factors, but a couple that are really important. There's the geography. Fiji is very centrally located in the region, and it really is the best jumping off point for a lot of islands in the area, especially the ones closer to it, like Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, and places like Tonga or Tuvalu, and the Cook Islands as well. Those are all nearby and not really near any of the larger cities like Honolulu. Or Guam even are still pretty far away, so it has a geographical advantage. But secondly, like I mentioned, it has a huge infrastructure advantage that really no other airport has at all. Because in all these other islands, you have airports that are essentially, I think many of them are taking up or using like artificial land reclamation to actually build these runways because the islands themselves don't even have enough land or are incredibly narrow because of all the atoll development over time. So when it comes to infrastructure, there really is no other possible airport in a really good geographical location that can support all of these services. Because of course there is Auckland Airport, there is Melbourne Airport, and there is Guam Airport, but they're all very far away from everything else. That Nandi really is the only adequate way to transfer.
I mean, yeah, well, it certainly makes sense, but like, you know, it's other airlines have certainly tried. Like Nauru Airlines back in the heyday, right? They were operating flights to and from Nauru and everywhere. They were operating, to far-flung places, Singapore, um, Taipei. I don't believe they ever operated. Did they? I don't believe Nauru Airlines ever operated to Hawaii. But basically, it basically was Nauru Airlines back when before the whole country became bankrupt. It was operating, sort of how Fiji Airways is now in trying to increase its destinations everywhere. So, I think, definitely another big factor in this is like the development of the country itself, right? Not only in terms of, well, like you said, right, the airport as well as the central location. I guess in terms of the Pacific, centrally located is not, there isn't exactly a clear cut definition at all, right? Because it is all islands, and you have to take into factor, where the islands are well, where the islands are, and also the relative water length between them all, right? Water distance.
Mm-hmm.
But I and tell me what you think about this. But like Fiji itself has the only another reason Fiji Airways was able to grow so fast was because Fiji itself, like you mentioned, was already a very, very notable tourist destination compared to other countries like Nauru, which certainly was not. And so even though they had the money at that time, they had the routes they were trying to push at that time, it just didn't work at all for them. The planes were leaving with like, I think an average was like 15-20% capacity.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
not as
20%.
familiar with the capacity that these flights were using as much as you are.
Well, I mean, I would say that's definitely one other factor, which also leads to the question of if one of the factors to becoming a successful airline like that is for your country itself to be an attractive destination. Like for example, airports like Dubai, right, Singapore, right. They are major hubs now, but even before, like flights were introduced. Flights, went to those places, flew to those places long before in history, but it was only once those places, Dubai and Singapore, became actual destinations in themselves that their aviation industries started to blossom. Do
Hmm.
you think that that is any possibility at all? And you know, do you think that is possible at all for a lot of these other smaller island countries? And if not, does that mean that they are forever doomed to be like that, to be as they are?
Let's think about it. Like, what can Nauru do to develop themselves? Like, essentially nothing. They're really just a small island, and
Well, yeah, you know what they can do? They can sign shady contracts with the Australian Immigration Center to have with the Australian Immigration Authority to have a detention center on Nauru.
yeah, because personally, from my experience, the only things I know about Nauru is that they have a huge obesity problem. They have like one ring road that goes around the island. They have a small airport, and that's about it. Really, actually, the only other thing that I know about is that all of the Pacific Islands are facing major threats of flooding from climate change, and actually that might be one of the keys to their development is if we put more of a spotlight on the challenges these islands are facing, they may gain more recognition and more people wanting to visit them. Like people can benefit from their own failures because, of course, with climate change getting worse, people may be like, "Oh, let's go visit Nauru before it is completely sunk." So, honestly,
Well,
that may be their
but
best
here's
opportunity.
but here's another thing, right? Well, obviously the people with that mindset, like, oh, let's go to Nauru before it sinks, is certainly in the minority. But like, that's another question. Like, if these countries, if we want to, if we want them to, sorry, if they want to, improve their aviation infrastructure, they first need money, and to do that, they would need, you know, more notoriety, as you said, right? More promotion. But how can you do that if you don't have airlines flying to and from?
And that's the challenge, and that really comes down to the policy recommendations. And actually, do you, when it comes to Nauru, there's obviously a long list of policy recommendations. Which one did you think would have fit Nauru the best specifically, or a small nation like that, as to how to run an airline in a really small country that has generally not been successful?
Well, I mean, I'll say like for Nauru itself, right? This is certainly, this is certainly a question that a lot of people want an answer to. Australia wants an answer. The government of Nauru desperately wants an answer. But what another major thing which we touched on that is critically important to keep in mind is that most of these airlines are government run and government owned and government run, right? Now, this is sort of, it's both a cause and an effect, right? It's a cause because, having government owned and government ownership generally means that, the interests are not in financial stability, right? The interests are generally not in turning a profit, which ultimately just leads to more losses and less money to do actual things, actual improvements. But it's also an effect because, because of the same problem, the loop, right? If you have less money to do things, then you won't be able to. Then it won't be as lucrative of an airline for investors, and so the only entity available to keep the services running is the government, right? And another thing which another aspect which many people often forget is that there are only two entirely governed two government run, right? There are only two profitable government run airlines in the entire world: Emirates and Singapore Airlines, right? And that is in no short part due to the fact that they are major, you know, destinations in their own right, and they also have a geographical advantage, in terms of the entire aviation realm. Other state-owned airlines, they are all unprofitable, right? But because they're not, in the Pacific, on tiny Pacific island nations, it's not too much of a liability for them. At least, relatively, right? Many people will argue that, Air India is a complete basket case, since it's government run. But in any case, because of this, right? Like I said before, there's just not much. The governments are caught in a trap, right? They have to have the aviation services to connect their countries with other places. You can't lose that connection, right? Otherwise, you're completely done for. But at the same time, because of that, you're hemorrhaging more money, and so it makes the airline less attractive for private investors. Um, so I guess that's sort of the situation there. Um, and yeah, in terms of actually, one of the recommendations that the paper does make is that it does recommend, um, it does recommend, the other major airlines on the fringes stepping up to help invest and in these sort of airlines, um, as well as for these airlines to better, I guess, have connectivity with the major airlines in the region, right? So what that means is basically Qantas Air New Zealand, and Fiji Airways helping to invest heavily in these other island nations airlines, as Qantas did with Fiji Airways, as well as the other island nations airlines, teeny tiny small airlines, offering more services to and from their investor country's destinations, offering more services to and from Fiji, Australia, and New Zealand. Um, which I think the first point is certainly, one thing which would definitely help them, would help the airlines. But,
Yeah, that's an
it's
interesting point because At least it reminds me of the essential air service in in the U.S. because that's where it's largely what I think the Pacific wants and what these countries want, where they can have some essentially
Hmm.
essential charter operator fly these routes, and
Yeah,
they're not going to be
exactly.
profitable, but then they can at least get paid by the government to operate them. But like we've mentioned, these governments really don't have those funds at all, and if there's an opportunity, I think first these countries should this really small countries with really few government funds really are in a bind because what would be ideal is if they could somehow get a private operator to do these routes, but obviously these routes are really unsustainable for even these private companies. If they want to bid for these flights, they're really not going to be able to gain a lot of profits or even sustainability on continuing to operate them. But if you have some larger investor airline like Qantas or Air New Zealand or Fiji Airways use their cash reserves to keep an airline afloat, that might actually be something that could work because in a sense it operates like it's not really a full public-private partnership, but it seems to function in that regard.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's almost exactly like, the essential air service, right? How the United States, you know, has contracts with small local airlines to operate unprofitable routes to, like, I don't know, rural Wyoming or whatever, right? Um, it's sort of, I think that's sort of exactly what, like you said, exactly what the tiny Pacific Island nations want. The problem is they don't have the money to get that program started in the first place, right? Um, but again, this scheme also has a lot of challenges. Well, obviously, first of all, right, the governments of the small countries, um, they would, uh, if all the small island nations they were like American states, then the United States with the full economic power of the United States, right? It would sort of solve these problems. But obviously, nobody's they're not going to give up their political sovereignty. And so what you have is all these places, right? They don't have the money to get it set up in the first place. But that also raises a lot of questions too. Let's say for example, right, the island nation of Nauru or Tuvalu or whatever, or maybe even a regional system, which could be certainly very interesting. Um, a regional essential air service esque service, intergovernmental service. Let's say, right, that there are flights provided to and from, let's say, Nauru and Tonga, right?
Yeah,
It's it would raise more questions in that, like, once you getting it started is one thing, keeping it is a whole nother thing. Because again, right, even if you operate that flight, you need to, and even if there's a ton of investors, the investors they're not they're they're investing. It's basically like like getting a loan. It's not like getting a check from your grandma, right? They're gonna have to keep this up and going somehow, which also traces back to the whole problem of, like, the limited demand in the first place, as well as the limited wages in the first place, because there's no hard industry in a lot of these countries. There's no, I would say there's not major demand to travel to and from Nauru and Tonga, or Nauru and Niue, or like Wallace and Futuna, and you know wherever else, the Solomon Islands, right? So in that sense, right, would more and more investments from big airlines work, even if these were just like a financial basket case
yeah,
to
it's
begin with?
really difficult, and it probably is airport dependent and business dependent because some of these. The report also mentions that just in general, some of these airlines are making poor business decisions on which planes to get because Nauru Airlines operates some 737s, which generally with low load factors aren't going to be very helpful in maintaining a business. So you can throw all of this money into the business, but it also has to be investing in something that's making the right decisions. And of course, I think Fiji Airways has made some good decisions, but these smaller airlines they are in a bind as well because they want as many people as possible to come into the region and for tourism, but many of the airports don't support. larger planes, and they also don't have as much demand, so they can try all they want to have larger planes and to fly longer routes, but still need to be able to fill those planes, and that's really where a lot of these problems lie. One of the things that I'm curious about though is that a lot of these routes in general are super expensive, uh, in a region that is not particularly wealthy, and with many of these economies, like you mentioned, not paying very well. They're really only marketing themselves these tourists who can actually afford to pay for these routes, and I know if they lower their prices, they're gonna continue to lose money, but pricing too is, I think, it is a major part of the business model that has to be considered as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in that sense, it really, what that part reminds me of is like, for example, the Canadian North, right? Where the major Canadian cities in the South, right? Toronto, Montreal, they're all well connected, airport, aviation wise, right? And they have certainly cheaper flights, we shall say. But once you wander into the Arctic, once you wander into, for example, Nunavut, right, or the Northwest Territories, all of a sudden flights start costing thousands of dollars, even though first of all it's a domestic flight, and second of all it's only like what 4 hours. You can fly to and from like Toronto and London for cheaper than you can to and from Toronto and Iqaluit, right, the capital city of Nunavut. And I guess part of that is just because like we said, the lower demand and the relative lack of government subsidy. Um, but I guess another thing I'm actually not sure. Do people in like the Pacific Island nations, do they make more or less than we would consider here?
You
See.
mean in the U.S.? I would assume they make far less.
Oh, Nauru doesn't even have a minimum wage.
Yeah, I would
Wow.
imagine it's pretty grim in terms of what the wages are, and I don't even know how many jobs there are just in general. Like there can't be really that many.
Oh, here I found this in 2006. That's the last year they had data for. Well, actually no. Actually no. Here's the 2021 average salary: 790 Australian dollars per month, 600 US dollars per month.
So that's
Wow.
only 7,200 a year. That's not good at all. And for these flights that
Yeah,
are costing up to, well, it was in 2007, it was close to $600 one way for one of these flights.
a month's income, effectively.
And that's just for one
It's about
person.
Yeah, for one person, right? And a month's income just for one flight. Or how that's how much one of your that's how much one of your meals cost, right? In the Bay Area,
Yeah.
because that's how expensive everything is. A $600 meal.
But
But
on the,
wow,
oh
this
yeah, the prices are certainly not going to market themselves at all for the locals, but I guess on the vein of locals, this does remind me, in shifting a bit to just a slightly different strategy. So also similar to the Central Air Service, we have in Alaska. There's a lot of these milk run routes, and the article talks a lot about how milk runs could be viable for the region, in the sense that it supports the locals traveling between a lot of cities, first of all, but it also makes it so that you can have, say, one route that maybe originates in Honolulu and ends in, say, Auckland, but it makes stops along the way in places maybe like Nauru or in Tonga, or in the Solomon Islands, and it can do that at a much more sustainable rate because it can take in more passengers, while also not only using one plane. So, and I wonder what the viability of that is. Of course, the article mentions it, but it really only applies it for what I believe was just the level 3 and level 4 routes. So the larger cities. But I wonder what it's like for the smaller cities.
Well, first of all, let's give a context because that was a lot of terminology, right? A milk run route is kind of what we described, the island hopper route, which is one plane flying from one place to another place with a lot of stops in the middle, right? So think United Airlines. What is it? Honolulu to Guam by Chuuk, Korsai, Pohnpei, Kwajalein, and Majuro. Or like or like as you said, Alaska Airlines, or back in the day, right, when milk run routes were the only option. You'd fly from like London to Berlin to what? I don't know, Belgrade to Istanbul to Baghdad to wherever else, right? Um, and then also, so that's the sort of island hopping route, right? Exactly like what we mentioned before. That's certainly an idea. But Jack, you also did say like, what was that you said? You said like type 1 2
Yeah,
routes,
I believe the article only
level 1.
applies it for. It mentions possibly using it for for the larger routes, the level 3, I believe.
So can you give like a little summary of what that is? Level 1 2 3 4.
Yeah, so the level 3 routes, or I guess I should start at level 1. So level 1 is domestic routes of island nations in particular. So that's just within islands, so like within Fiji or within the Solomon Islands. And then you get to the level 2, which are the interregional, so that could be between, say, Tuvalu and the Solomon Islands, but it also specifies that they're non-jet routes. They're still on super small aircraft. But then you go up to the level 3, which are the same interregional but on jet routes. So that is like a Nauru Airlines flight, which does operate Boeing 737s. And then you get to the level 4, which are the international routes, like longer haul routes, and more longer haul into to bigger airports. Essentially, the maximum you can get in the region. So it's not like a Tahiti to Los Angeles, but maybe like a Tahiti to Auckland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it also does say, level 2 routes are the ones that are mostly regional, and the report does make clear, quite clear in its description that they are of quote little commercial value, right? Which goes to show, how most of these routes are just basket cases, and then it's only, once you get to level 3 and 4, the like commercial routes start to become mostly economically viable, right? Generally from Australia and New Zealand, as well as wide body jets to other international destinations. So, you know, in terms of like, for example, an island hopping route, right? Obviously, that even for example the United's island hopping route to and from Honolulu and Guam, it already has major demand from the United States military, because the U.S. military will put a lot of their soldiers, a lot of their servicemen who are to service, who are going to be placed on these, small island nations, who are on these small bases, onto the United flight. So it already has a lot of predetermined demand right there. But I think in terms of for the other Pacific Island nations, well, it's obviously more tough in that regard, but it's also more tough because, you know, first of all, there would need to be major agreements on what exactly an arrangement would be, whether it be, one airline doing the whole thing, and if for example, right, it does fall short of performance, then who exactly would pay for it, right? And that's actually another thing which the report does make sure to mention, which is underwriting, the concept of underwriting, right? Which is effectively an agreement where the government agrees to cover losses if an airline does not perform, if it does not meet its targets, um, you know, if its targets are not met and passenger loads are not met either. So there would need to be arrangements like that made, and would also need, put a lot of stress and pressure on already economically strained nations and governments. Um, so I would say that's definitely one of the reasons that, well, it's not just I would say, right? It is one of the reasons that even though it has been 14 years since this report came out, there has been almost no progress in that regard.
Yeah, but also it's interesting. In those 14 years, there have been a dramatic decline of low-cost carriers in the region from there being almost a flourishing number of them to there being essentially zero at this point. With many of them just folding or just ceasing operations, and I don't know if it's too early to say whether there's been effects from that, but certainly this article makes it seem like the low cost carriers were promising because they not only many of them were private companies that were disrupting operations and actually showing a significant drop in prices, but they were able to operate services that previously weren't offered, of course, because they were private companies that had a much different business model that were much less full service airlines. And I am curious to see what the region will look like with no low cost carriers, because it is like a dramatic shock to the industry, which had them for at least 10 years.
Well, it's not only that, right? It's the lack the when the low cost carriers when they first were launched, right? Like Polynesian Blue, right? The report also makes clear that when they first took off when they first took off, right? Um, Tourism levels in their corresponding countries shot up dramatically, right? So if you look at, for example, Polynesian Blue, Sydney to Apia in Samoa, or for example Pacific Blue between Australia and Tonga, right? You will see like on the graph, the number of tourist arrivals are nearly twice or even thrice as much as they were prior to having those carriers. And so one of the only industries that can offer some income, however limited it may be, is tourism, right? Is tourism in these small island nations, and it's something that all of them desperately want to capitalize on, right? Which is entirely obvious by the likes of Fiji Airways or Air Tahiti Nui. But the problem is, a lot of even though they were low cost carriers, the routes, it just still wasn't enough, right? The routes themselves, they're not profitable even now as government owned, right? When they're charging massive fares and having very low, load factor. But as a low cost carrier, right, where inherently you have to save on costs, with already, even though it did cause an uptick in demand, it still wasn't enough to actually keep the airline model sustainable. The one by one, the airlines, they either collapsed, or they were acquired by other larger airlines, or they reverted back to government ownership. So that's certainly another challenge. And I guess it'll be, we said this before, right? And it's always a case of speculation, but now we'll have to see if another low cost carrier ever will be viable again in the Pacific region. Especially even considering, right, like nearby in Australia and New Zealand, there's not a super well,
There is
there's not a super strong. What's that?
well, there is Jetstar, and
That's what I was gonna say. There's Jetstar. There's what, Tiger Air.
yeah, I believe
Is that what it's called?
Tiger was bought by or
Well, it's Scoot, but that's Singapore. Yeah. No, they're all Singapore. There is Jetstar, right?
and Jetstar
But
is big to their credit.
it is big to the credit, right? But it's certainly nothing like what we've seen in Europe or Asia, offering truly local. We've to be honest, we don't even really have it here in America either, where the low cost carriers, sometimes their fares are equally as high as the major airlines. So it will, whether or not we can establish low cost carriers in one of the most economically depressed parts of the world is certainly up to speculation.
Well, and out of curiosity, if there were to be a new low cost carrier, where do you think it would start from?
I mean, the obvious answer here is Fiji. That's the obvious answer.
Yeah,
I guess.
I can't disagree.
Yeah. Well, see, the problem with that is, right, there would need to be, no matter what happens, there needs to be major government action taken to either ensure, something along the lines of the essential air service, or something along the lines of underwriting, where the government fills in the gaps, or, even some sort of alliance, right, in terms of establishing an intergovernmental bloc, right, to keep these services up and running, basically, because even if you think of because even how do I say this, even routes of major airlines, which we would expect to be profitable, right? For example, the government, so for example, the report specifies specifically, in terms of when it was talking about Air New Zealand, that Air New Zealand had to cut down on its, what was it? Air New Zealand had to cut down on its Singapore routes, I believe, right? Um,
I'm not actually sure, so I wouldn't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah. Because of financial struggles, the airline had to withdraw services to Singapore, which is just, you would expect Singapore and Auckland to be a pretty decent connection, um, but apparently it was not, you know, profitable at all. So in the case of a Fiji-based low-cost carrier or wherever else, right? Maybe by some magic it'll be based in Nauru, right? Um, you would need major government action to prevent it from completely collapsing, and just let you know not let it fall into either capitalism completely taking over and just losing service almost everywhere, or letting government completely take over, and then having fares be ridiculously high with very low capacity, because you're not able to charge the prices that you need and only operate the flights that you need.
Yeah, I
What do you
would.
think?
Well, it really depends. So I was at least intending this. A new low cost carrier probably would be fully privatized with little government intervention, which, as we've discussed, is not going to be profitable. Uh, especially well, it probably really depends on who's backing. If it's someone super rich with a lot of funding and capital already, it might actually have success in expanding. And expansion really is key, because if you can have connections where you don't have to say wait 24 hours for the next flight because the flight only operates 2 or 3 days a week. If you have a lot of connection possibility or coverage possibility, then you might be able to have success in bringing more tourists, which obviously is probably going to be a guarantee no matter what. But if you can do that consistently, then yeah, you might have a successful airline. If it has the low fares and can do that in a profitable manner, that might actually be something that would benefit all countries, and that countries would be interested, because like as we mentioned, at the root of this is that they're not really, none of them are really doing great economically, and if we want to resolve that, we have to continue to invest in tourism development and tourism potential, and of course climate change is making that harder, but if we can continue to do that and to bring more people to the region, that I think can certainly be start and be provoked by a new low cost carrier. uh, but also the one last question I had, and on solution wise, is that the article really never mentions in a structured manner. What do you think is the possibility of just every single airline in the region aligning in an alliance like Vanilla Alliance in a sense? Of course, Qantas and Air New Zealand already are in separate alliances, but what if all of the airlines code shared together and really liberalized in a sense with no regulation on competition?
I mean, I would think that there's not much competition to begin with. You know, like there's only what not like Nauru only flies to and from. There's only like what, five connections to and from Nauru.
Yeah.
There's only one airline that operates between Nauru and Fiji. Um, you know, there's only Air Vanuatu is only focused on connecting cities to and from Port Vila. I don't think now, I would say now is not the time to think about that. That's maybe for later on once demand grows a bit, and there's more options. For now, it's the the Vanilla Alliance, right? It's I guess it makes sense because of regional based carriers aligning and having more easy connections and services and all that. But I think now, right now, actually no, I guess it would make sense, but in terms of making it easy to travel to and from these places, I think first and foremost should be focused on the cost, and also the ability to have services in the first place. Because first of all, a lot of services just aren't existent, so the having an alliance wouldn't exactly be too necessary. And second of all, with the routes that they do have, a lot of the prices are sky high, and it's just not feasible to for a lot of travelers. But what do you think? Do you think an alliance would be good?
Yeah, well, I was well. The article makes it a point that for a lot of these larger routes, countries would benefit from a lot of liberalization and cutting back on a lot of regulations. Of course, we've done that in America with the Deregulation Act in 1978, and and I would assume an alliance just is a manifestation of more cooperation and less regulation on which airlines can fly where, and I think that would benefit everyone because like you mentioned, there really isn't actually a lot of hard competition on any of these routes, and if there is just more cooperation, code sharing, and trying to get people just to come because the business of these airlines really doesn't matter. They're all in the business of promoting and bringing people to the countries, and if that's what can happen, then that's great, and that relies obviously on sustainable air service. And if airlines are in it together, then I think that it's really only going to be positive. I think.
I mean, hey, who knows? Like just as maybe I guess to connect it to the beginning of the episode, maybe a rich billionaire who went to space will step in and fix the whole problem. Give money to all the airlines.
And $1 billion is going to be way more than any of these governments can provide.
Exactly.
But anyway, that we are running short on time. So if you have any concluding thoughts, I would love to hear it. And
I want to go to the Pacific. That's it.
yeah, I do too. And Drew Binsky's in Palau right now. I know you love Drew Binsky, but he will be producing some content from there, and maybe that'll inspire people to travel there. But besides that, this does conclude our episode on aviation in the Pacific. Stay tuned for our episodes next week, and hopefully you enjoyed listening. And as always, let us know your comments or feedback in the comments area.